Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Weaving Possibilities with community-minded Calgarians. This week I'm talking with Jodi. Jodi is a profound facilitator and is someone who, in this conversation, really speaks to the value of boundaries and identifying who and what we're responsible for. Jodi and I talk a little bit about connection to nature, what it means to have emotions in the work of social justice, and ultimately their story about how this past year has helped them really ground themselves in who they are and what it means to show up for their community. So take a listen and enjoy. Good afternoon. I'm super excited to be talking to Jodi. Jodi and I have known each other, gotten to know each other actually a lot over the last year, and have had some really wonderful conversations. And so I'm really excited to just sort of learn, as I always do, about the ways in which you see community and how insightful you are on various things. And so I guess for people who maybe are curious, like, what do you do? But I'm curious about a little bit of where do you know from?
Sure.
So that's kind of the opening question here. We can kind of start our conversation off is, Jodi, where do you know from?
Sure. Thanks, Tyson. So I guess maybe in conjunction with kind of what do I do and where do I know from, I'll start with where do I know from and then talk a little bit about what are some of the things I do.
Great.
So knowing for me is really about inner awareness. And I think part of that is because I was raised in a religious tradition where I really was taught a bit around discernment and a bit around how to know what I know about the world. And as I got older and deconstructed, inner knowing and learning a bit about how do I make sense of the world became really important for me. So for me, I think these days, inner knowing really comes from my body. So I can tell when a couple days ago, I was having a conversation and I was starting to lose feeling in my fingers and my toes. And it took me a really long time to start to learn that's a stress response for me. It was something that happened to me kind of all through childhood and all through my young adult years. But because I grew up in a Christian tradition that really taught body knowledge is not a thing and it's all about head knowledge and spiritual knowledge, there's been a lot of reclamation and a lot of recovering work that I've had to do to start to come back into my body and start to understand how I know what I know. So these days it's from listening to my body, but also a lot of it for me comes from listening to my heart. There's a deep inner thing for me that happens when I know something. And I was taught growing up that knowing was a lot about analysis. So like I mentioned, I grew up in a Christian tradition. And so everything I was taught was about, well, what does the Bible teach and how do you explain that? And how do you look at the context? How do you understand? And what I've had to do is deconstruct that as well in my own life and realize that a lot of the ways I know things are things that I can't quite put my finger on, are things that are inside of me. And I think also are things that connect me to my community. So I also, inner knowing for me, or knowing in general, comes from close relationships with people I trust and letting them reflect who I am back to me and being able to see and trust that. And it also comes from the natural world for me and being able to learn from this is random, but right now I have a relationship with the large lilac tree outside my house. Okay. And I go and I spend time with her every few days. And I say her because there's just the sense to me that she's this large matriarch. And I know that's really kind of, out of the bounds of how we often understand our relationship and how we often understand our knowing. But I have learned a lot from her this year about boundaries and about also the things that kind of live within her branches and the way she mothers them. And that's been a sense of knowing and a sense of learning about my own kind of not being a matriarch, but being in a female body, what it looks like to know and what it looks like to be in relationship with people in my community. So that's a little bit of a random how I know some things.
Can I ask a little bit about how does that lilac tree show you in what they do that boundaries are important? What about?
Yeah. So this time of year, especially, the tree is like really, really large, and it has like a lot of branches that go kind of straight up and then branching out over the sidewalk. And I can kind of come, anyone could come and just stand under the branches, but you can't get to the core. Like it's such a like wide, like I couldn't even put my arms around it. And it's like, it's protecting what's inside. The branches are like kind of pokey. So you couldn't even get inside if you tried. And yet it like is encompassing, and yet like you can walk under it and stand under it. And so there's this sense of being like with it, but also like being separate from it and kind of recognizing. And so for me this last year, like one of the things I've been reflecting on are, as a human, what are my responsibilities? What are my boundaries? And what are the roles that I take on in my relationships? And I feel like that tree has been teaching me a lot about like its role in like in my front yard, like right over the sidewalk. But also like some of the responsibilities it holds. There's like a large nest up in the top of it. And every year, different birds nest in it. And that's like a responsibility that it has and a relationship it has with those birds. And then also a bit about its boundaries, like how you can't get into the core of it, but it is still in interdependent relationships.
Interesting. Can I ask, so using kind of like the tree as a living example, but also like the metaphor of like where in sort of your community practice have you had to put up some of those boundaries like that tree that's in front of your house, but also like how have you been able to branch out and care for the people who are experiencing all the great work that you do? Like there's sort of those two things. I'm curious, like what does that mean?
Yeah, so sure. So to kind of get to that, I'll tell you just a little bit about one of the things I do to start. And so I started an initiative with a colleague 5 years ago called Refugia Retreats, and we do retreat and facilitation. And it's largely about creating spaces for people to connect with their own inner world, as well as to connect with their communities, and then to connect with their more than human world as well. Kind of those three things. And so for me this last year, kind of going into the year, I ran 2 community of practices in connection with Refugia, where we had depending on the community, between 6 and 12 people that were a part of it. And one of the things for me when I facilitate is I've been really learning how to show up as myself, but also what it looks like to hold space in the room. So Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a community activist and writer and teacher, talks a lot about like not right sizing yourself. So not blowing yourself up bigger than you actually are, but also not shrinking yourself down. And in the body and the background that I have been taught to shrink over and over again. And I've been taught to make myself invisible to be safe. And so a lot of the work I've been doing this last year has been around like, how do I show up and not blow myself up and not take up more space than is good or healthy or interdependent, but also like, how do I not shrink? Because that's also not healthy for people. And in this community of practice, I've been practicing that honestly. And also like, I've been kind of realizing that a lot of my guides, especially growing up, a lot of folks who were in leadership in my life, really showed up with a sense of perfectionism. There's a facade that I need to show you versus a reality of who I am. And so for me, that doesn't feel authentic. But I'm also realizing like, it's not healthy for anyone if I show up and I'm like projecting some of the stuff I'm working to heal all over people. Right. So there's a balance there. And that's, I think, part of what I've been learning from the Lilac tree is kind of what that balance looks like. Someone else that I really respect, who's a writer named Nadia Bolz-Weber, talks about sharing out of your scars and not out of your wounds when you're sharing in a professional capacity. And that's some of the work I've been trying to do is like, how do I show up and share the things that I'm learning and growing in, but do it in such a way that it is like a window in and helpful for people and not projecting things that I haven't healed from into those communities. Does that answer the question you asked?
Yeah, I think so. And another question I wanted to ask about, like, well, I mean, what it sounds like is the representation of, or what's been role modeled to you through the Lilac tree has been that sense of like of direction, a little bit about how to take some of those things that you've experienced and go like, yeah, I when to be sort of prickly and when to also have to know sort of where you can be responsible and who you're responsible to and how you show up, right? What that looks like. And you talked a little bit about, I guess the word that's coming to my mind, authentic leadership. And like, what does it mean to be authentic leader? And you've said that you've identified that like you've had maybe not the best leadership in terms of people feeling that they feel like they can show up, whether for whatever reasons, that and maybe not even that they are aware of, but that like, how have you been able to show up differently than maybe what's been role modeled to you? But
Yeah.
and what has that what has that been like? Like, how have you what's the impact of that?
Yeah, I think some of the ways that I'm practicing showing up differently are around doing my own work around intergenerational healing, as well as my own somatic work. So I mentioned at the beginning that coming back into relationship with my body is not a thing I had been taught how to do growing up, or how to understand body knowledge. And so I think for me, like there's been a really heavy invitation and emphasis in my life on like, how do I do my own work and what is that work that I need to do? Both around like being in a white body in a culture that's really racist, where I was raised with like internalized racism. Like I was raised in the Midwest in the States in a very white Christian background. And so both around that, but then I think also around perfectionism and needing to try, like being taught to show up with this facade of who I am versus who I actually am and what I'm actually in process around. So those are things that I've been working through and trying to do work both like through reading. I'm in a couple small groups around body practice and specifically around white bodied supremacy and how to deconstruct it. And then also like in my community relationships. So I have a close community of friends who we don't know that we would name it this, but I feel like we have a practice of speaking truth to each other about who we are. And for me, that's like a really strong value. I read a book called, I think it's actually called How We Show Up by Mia Birdsong this summer. And she talks a lot about accountability really being like people, I hope I can say this right, but she basically talks about accountability being people holding you to what you say you want to be in the world and to who. So instead of like, we often have this idea of accountability where it's like, we need to hold this person to account for this ideal that we hold. Right. And she talks about it in the sense of like, what are the ideals and values that you hold? And then accountability is your community holding you to those values and ideals. And so that is like kind of the practice that I hope to cultivate. And I feel like I am cultivating with like my friends. And I also hope within the other communities that I'm a part of, where if I say that I'm this, I would like want people that I'm in relationship with to be able to say to me, you're not actually living out of that today. Let's talk about that.
Right.
Or to come back.
What's wrong? Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Here, like the idea of has that, and maybe, and we can talk about sort of like within that intentional community you're creating with friend groups. And I'm curious, has that cultivating that, like, here's who I am, and that's what it means for me to like that sense of accountability. I'm curious, how has that played itself out in some of the ways in which community has responded to that, to you?
Yeah, honestly, I think one of the biggest ways it's played itself out for me is it's always interesting to talk about like family trauma and some of that sort of stuff, but I will go there a little bit. Like, I think one of the biggest things for me is that I was raised in a family that my needs didn't matter. And I was really taught to like show up for my family's needs. And there's a lot of trauma there and a lot of history there around that. But because of that, I I feel like where I've been being held accountable is around being able to name my own needs, and also being able to also name my own strengths and weaknesses, because what has happened for me for a long time is I've had a hard time seeing what those are, because I came from a family and also honestly a religious community that really said this is who you are and this is who you should be. Right. And I wasn't able to explore who I actually am, and therefore wasn't often able to see what I actually bring. And so that's been a really long process. And I will also say therapy is very helpful along the way in that too. But like, that's been a really long process of like me building relationships where I trust what they say about me, and where I trust that they actually see me and are able to say, like, this is who you are, and also what are your needs, and can hear those needs too.
It's interesting. I'm going to maybe keep coming back to that lilac tree, because and I've having not seen it, but thinking about like that idea, like naming, being able to like name what your needs are, and also being able to like that kind of like it is a tree and it does these particular things, and it is not, you know, it provides a certain function, and it's connected to, you know, a wider ecosystem and relationships, but like there's elements that like this is what I do, and this is the things that I'm able to do. And I think I'm curious about, and like how valuable I think like boundaries are, being able to like say like, here's like, this is what I'm possible. This is what's possible with what with who I am, or my experiences are, you know, where I know from, you know. Has there been maybe a sense for you in this last year about like continuing to like go into that tree analogy of like being like rooted, like what that like it like what's been rooting you? Because I feel like from past people I've been talking to, just generally how I feel, it's been kind of hard almost to feel rooted and yet not going anywhere at the same time. Like I don't mean physically, just mean like it feels like there's just like this void that I'm existing, and trying to feel rooted in things, and especially in community, has been really difficult for me as being someone who's really, I think, prior to this year, feels like has always been really rooted in community and shows up, but then it's like all of those things have been kind of taken away, and yet still trying to find that root. Like where have you been able to ground yourself?
Well, I think you named that there has been a paradox there this year. And I think like, so the caveat I guess I want to say is there have been times I felt rooted and other times where I felt uprooted throughout the year, or somehow disconnected. So I think like when I think about rooting this year, let me just think about that for a second. Like honestly, to return to that, I do think like some of the more than human connections that I've had this year have felt like they've really rooted and grounded me when, and I guess it's more than a year now, but when COVID really first started, my anxiety was the highest it's ever been. And I found that I felt very unrooted and very disconnected. And something that made me feel more connected and made me feel more human was actually like watching the birds out my window and like watching their interplay and their relationships and their connections. And I think from that, like one of the things that I started then, which hasn't been running now, but I started to meet with friends kind of once a week. We did like a podcast club where it was basically just an opportunity online to check in, to listen to a podcast together, and then have a deeper conversation about it. And that, like, I think overwhelmingly deeper conversations are something that helped me to feel rooted. So as much as like I have been physically in community with people less in the last year or two, I think I've been able to cultivate a practice of like having still deeper conversations with folks and connecting with people in that way. And that has made me feel rooted as well. And then some of our activities have shifted. Like we got a better fire pit, and almost all year long, we try to like meet for fires and connect when we can physically. But it's been I think part of it for me has been uprooting enough to let the manifestations of what does root me shift and change.
Right. And what can like grow too, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting to say like a fire pit too, where it's like that's like the elements, right? And that's something that really has been connecting you through your work. Can you talk a little bit more about like how, and right now, I mean, we are going through a climate crisis, and I'm curious, like, where, like, that sense of like the elements and being something that's really, I think, first of all, I think we all, in order for us to really understand our own position within climate justice and climate change, I think a deeper relationship with those, with nature and elements is really important, because to your point, I think we're often raised without. Well, I mean, we're just not raised without like that being something that you are connected to. And I think a lot of, learnings and relationships I have with those who identify as Indigenous, has been really important to me to be able to, like there's this equality here that's really important. And so I guess I'm just wondering a little bit from your perspective for the last couple of years, or maybe even currently right now, like how has that been fitting? Like I know you said like building that relationship, but like what has been able to kind of grow from the last little while?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. A few of the things that I have seen kind of growing are, so with Refugia, with some of the work in the communities of practice that we do, largely it had been place-based. So that was mostly like people would come out and we'd have a retreat or we'd do a workshop at somewhere. And so everyone in that community were people that lived in that vicinity essentially, or had come to that vicinity. But this year, a lot, because the work has gone online, it's become more Alberta based. And so that has been really cool, is to watch like people connect from Edmonton with people from Lethbridge and people from Calgary, and just have these conversations about what does it look like to be in relationship both with my own inner work, but also with the more than human world, and thinking about climate and thinking about those sorts of relationships that we need to have in order to move forward in a healthy way, whether that is possible when we look at climate change right now or not. I think we could have that conversation too, but one of the things that I've been learning about myself and about that community is that emotions are the work of social justice. And so that's a quote from Shaquille Chaudhry, who wrote a book called Deep Diversity. And I heard him on a CBC podcast maybe a month ago. And that just clicked for me, that for me, like when it comes to climate, when it comes to being in relationship with our communities and the more than human world, and some of the like challenging things that we're going to continue to navigate, whether that's with pandemics or whether that's with floods and fires, we actually need to be doing that work on an emotional level together. The work of like processing it, the work of grieving it, the work of like moving into deeper relationships as communities, the work of challenging our notions around like what we think is possible and why we think what we think is possible. And if we're ever going to move forward. One of the things I say all the time is like, I think we have all the tech knowledge we need on some levels to deal with this crisis, but we don't have the political and personal will. And I think part of that is because, coming back to Shaquille Chaudhry, part of his quote was like, emotions are the work of social justice. What's at stake if we don't do that work is that we don't make progress. And yeah, for me, so much of it is encapsulated in that. And I've been realizing that's part of my work, I think, in my communities, is to show up and help create containers for emotions.
Interesting. I really like that emotions are social justice, is because I think in order for us to really do anything, our feelings and emotions are what really drive us, and that and there's this wide spectrum of what that can do for us, or where we need to kind of start. with sort of processing and really engaging with our emotions. And that's actually something that I think in some ways, kind of a little bit of a windy road here, where I feel like people that I know who've shifted in community, who've maybe, for a lot of people, we know people who've broken up with a significant other, or have, made really, or have moved, or have changed jobs, or have really changed their sense of what it means for the community, good or bad.
Yeah.
But I feel like in conversations with people have been a little bit more at peace with their decisions about what's next for them. Obviously not everybody, but some of that like sense of like, oh, I'm doing this now because I've had to actually sit with the emotions of the work that needs to actually be done, that maybe have taken 10 years to do, but like because we've had to actually stop and like be like, oh, like take that break and reconnect with a myriad of different things.
Mm-hmm.
And what would that mean for like community, a sense of community, to actually like I mean, and you've talked a little bit about it, but I'm just curious, like where, like with that train of thought, like where do you, like how vital, and I know like Refugia, how vital it is to actually stop and take that break and like connect with your emotions.
Yeah.
And then that change. Yeah. I'm just.
Yeah. So you're leading me into my like big rant that I go on. So hopefully
please
it will
do.
be articulate or cohesive, which I can't guarantee either. But I think where I think capitalism has really led us is into this place of toxic productivity, which is we are what we do and our worth is tied to what we do. And so that leaves out so many people in our society, not the least of which is the more than human world too, because suddenly land becomes important in as much as you can commodify it, or in as much as it's worth money, and not in as much as it's a living being that we're related to and in relationship with. But also it leaves out people who have differences in their cognitive abilities or differences in their like physical abilities, because if you can't work at a certain standard, you're seen as less productive and you're seen as worthless. And I think that slowing down and reconnecting, like it sounds simplistic, but I think that it starts to shift everything, because we start to realize when you start to reconnect in community, and I think so much of that starts individually and then also in community, but I think often we can't start that individual work on our own because it seems daunting. So the beginning of the pandemic, I think, is probably in some ways a good example, because we saw so many people doing all these other things like baking bread. There were all these trends that kept popping up, because we didn't know what to do with ourselves when we had time to do things. And I think that's because we get looped into this toxic productivity of we have to be busy all the time. We have to be constantly working all the time, because then that will show that we matter. And if we're able to slow down, so I used to live and work at a retreat center. And one of the things that we would always notice there, and I'll often say to people, is if you're coming from a season of a lot of busyness, you might feel really jittery for the first day or two. It might be really hard to focus. You might just need to sleep. And all of those things are okay. And all of those things indicate that you're leaving one rhythm and trying to enter a different rhythm for a period of time. And I think community processes can help us to do that in ways that are a little bit less jarring. So one of the things we would do when I worked out there is we'd invite people out for just like a day retreat to kind of start to disconnect from the busyness. And we'd do that together. So there'd be like maybe 10 people there for the day. We'd start with a bit of conversation about what retreat can look like and how disconnecting from that busyness might feel. And then we'd give people some like ideas of what they could do, whether that's just like having a nap for the day, going for a walk, noticing what draws your attention and spending some time with it. I'll often give people poems and be like maybe spend some time with it and just notice what words draw your attention and like think about them for a bit or meditate on them. And then we'll come back later on and share from that. And it's a rhythm that helps people kind of start to orient to a little bit slower pace of life. I don't know if that answered your question. That was a long chat.
Well, I think what's interesting about what you said about, and like that the bandwidth to slow down, to, with that kind of like even at the retreat center, doing that front loading of like, you're here to take this break, you're here to take a retreat, and like there's going to be maybe for the first time, like all like because of that productivity of being busy, and like how do you find your worth when you are slowing down because everything else about our world says that to speed up in order to be valuable and to sit with that and to maybe not sense your emotions. I guess I'm just curious, something that I was thinking about is we've had, I think culturally, there's been a lot of emotional things that have happened. And in a lot of ways, the reaction has been really emotional, which is good because it drives people to like a sense of change. But then there isn't that like we still need to slow down, because when I hear like emotions are social justice, right? So right, I think, and I feel like there's like either before that or a middle part there in some ways, and based on what we're talking about is to kind of to our community, our sense of community to sort of take that and like take it in for like for how we're feeling. Because I think oftentimes our emotions drive us, but it's always like, and it's like urgent response. And then it's like, so like that it like, what does that mean for the work that our actions are actually doing? Versus it's like, if there's like this emotions, but also with this sort of context of like, let's sit with this to actually really think about it. And I guess I think actually what I sometimes see even within climate related actions is this like the sense of and maybe even like in like community organizing too, where it is let's do this thing because our emotions are ready and ready and willing to do it. But then the long term isn't actually there. So it feels it can lead us to very short term results versus I think obviously what we all want is that long term systems change around things. And I know this isn't necessarily where we want to go with our systems with this idea, like, but how do you, but like that need for slowing down, creating that sense. And to your point, even earlier, it's like being rooted and being able to really be able to build that. Anyway, it's been, there's a lot of interesting things here that you've brought up, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and so one thing I wanted to say is just to step back for a moment too and say that like, as much as like I was kind of saying, so many of us end up defining our worth by what we do because that's what we're taught in capitalism. Right. There are also barriers for a lot of folks to slowing down. If you're a single mom, if you're someone who like for the last year, I've been working in culture, right? So I'm working kind of 4 jobs and well aware of like, I'm also trying to figure out ways to slow down so that I can authentically come from that. But also I need to like make money to actually afford a roof over my head and for all of those pieces too. And so I guess I just want to say the ideal that I hold is that I want to live in a world where everyone can slow down enough to be connected to their own lives, to each other, and to the more than human world. And that's what, for me, like that's what drives a lot of what I'm working towards is like, what are the processes that help us slow down? And I like to your point about emotions often being like feeling urgent. I think like that's where reflective and contemplative practices can come into play. And so those are practices that help us actually step back and check in and think about like, what am I actually feeling in this moment? Is this what I'm feeling, or is there something beneath that? Where am I noticing that in my body? What is the urgency I'm feeling here? And like actually help us to check in. And then also take intentional steps outside of that when we start to move again. And so that can be something like, that can be questions that help you orient. Often in retreats or in facilitation, the way I try to orient it is I try to orient it so there's like individual practice and community practice as well. So people would go away and like notice things or check in with themselves and have some time to think, some time maybe to journal if that's helpful for them, or meditate, whatever that piece might be, and then come back into community together. And so to me, I think that's actually really important, that piece of like how do you know what you know, and what does it look like to get to know yourself so that you can tap in to the things that are arising for yourself. And then also, what does it look like to bring that back into community in ways that are reciprocal and respectful, right. And then to move from there. And so to your point around urgency, I think that is one of the challenges, is we live in a climate crisis. We live in like really unequitable systems of like capitalism and imperialism. And like, I think part of the work is like trying to figure out how to resist, not just resist those, but like some sort of creative tension around like, how do we shift them? How do we flip them? How do we invite people into other things?
Well, you're talking a little bit about, I think, some maybe even like me too, like opportunities, like, I mean, maybe not as the traditional model of meditation, but like our journaling, our these sort of maybe practical ways where I think it's for our sense of community too, because to your point, I think sometimes busyness is actually a product of also just trying to survive, right? And yet, how can, in the scope of who we are, or even for myself, like, how do we provide bandwidth for relationships to occur where people can like, oh, I can maybe even stop briefly for a moment to sort of to build on those connections, because I think when we are often really go, it's at the detriment of our relationships. Yeah. And so, and then relationships are emotions, and, you know, we can kind of go back to that, but like, that to me, like that relationship piece is really important. And to your point about being able to connect with like that lilac tree outside your house, it's like that takes time to slow down, stop, and like look at it, and actually look at it and be like, oh, what does this mean for me?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. It takes engagement, I think, is what it comes back to for me. And like what I notice for myself is when I get too busy, everything feels like, I feel like I'm skirting on the surface of everything. And so it feels like I'm not actually landing, and I'm not actually present or intentional in the ways that I want to be. And out of that, I feel like that's when, like, often when I unintentionally create harm to myself or to others. And that's when like I like am moving so quickly that I don't take the time to like actually listen deeply. And I think a practice that's really helped me for that. So one of the other things I do is I'm a eco-spiritual director, which is a lot of words that don't make a lot of sense. But basically what that is like, I was trained in this art of like how to hold space for people in one-to-one relationships. So the people will come to me, and it's about process, and it's about like, so the process and the journey of your life, and being able to bring attention to that, and being able to slow down in ways that you're able to like listen to your own voice. And I've been going to a director for over 10 years now, and I go kind of once a month. And that has been something that's been really helpful for me to cultivate a sense of how to slow down in the midst of busyness, but also to start to notice when like my life's getting out of alignment or out of sync. And I will wrap that back around to, I think my community also lets me know in ways that are both vocal and sometimes not vocal. But I also notice in those conversations, because it's a time to just like pay attention.
We've talked a little bit, just kind of wrap up, we've talked a little bit about the sense of and value of slowing down that helps create boundaries and responsibility, and who you're accountable to, and like the power of emotions, and talk a little bit about leadership. I guess, and a lot of this may have, and this from your own experience, from what I've heard, is like, has really been some themes that have been going within this past year for you. What does it mean? And maybe it could be, you could respond to this in a couple ways. It could be about your sense of community, also maybe just for yourself, or, you know, bigger culture, but like, what do we do to, what does it mean to go forward? What
does it mean to go forward?
Yeah. What does it look like?
Yeah. I think I'm gonna get philosophical on you here.
Yeah, please.
Because I think for me, it's about like, walking hand in hand with both grief and joy. So a lot of this last year for me has felt really weird because there's been this deep invitation to joy in the midst of like what feels like climate collapse, and also really like awful systems, like looking at COVID, looking at like, yeah, all the things that are happening. There's been an invitation into like, what are the practices of joy for me? And I think I've been realizing for me, that's both individually, but that's also in community. Is like, there's a quote from this poet, Rainier Maria Rilke, that I love, that says, seek the depths of things. And for me, like the depths of human experience is really about being able to recognize our grief and our pain, and to do that in community together, as well as individually, but also to not stay there, and to also hold that in conjunction with presence and with joy, and noticing beauty around us, and recognizing that like there are large systemic things at play that are always happening too. And I think it's really important to grieve those and to work for changes around those, but also to not let them steal our joy at the same time, which sounds, I don't know, sounds really naive to me. But at the same time, I think that there's kind of pieces around like, what does it look like to reclaim that as individuals and as community together?
That is really, I think, a really great encapsulation of grief and joy being so, that really sits with me as like a real tangible way to be like, it's both. It can be both, and it's messy, but it's also really, it's real, it's realistic, that's the reality. So thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom. Is there anything else that you're sort of like, that's been pressing and percolating for you before we close off?
No, this has been like a really like great conversation. I've really actually enjoyed it, and I really didn't anticipate it taking the turns and twists that it did.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm really grateful for that. I think maybe the one other thing actually, as I say that, is just like to return to interdependence, like thinking about that lilac tree, and thinking about like, we didn't talk about my work in community organizing today, but I think one of the big community organizing things for this year has been around power with versus power over. And I have lots of thoughts on that I won't go into, but something I've been learning from living systems in the more than human world is like, power with is part of just being in reciprocal relationships, and recognizing that different parts of the more than human world have things that we need, and we have things that they need. And so what does it look like to partner together?
Well, we'll leave it on that, Jodi. Thank you so much for sharing, and appreciate this great conversation.
Thanks. Tyson.